What is up, fellow thermonuclear AFers? I am Dan Favale, coming at you with my certified fantabulous co-host Grant Hughes. We are joined by the also certified fantabulous, the one, the only, the legendary, one of the people's favorites, Caitlin Cooper of, I'm just going to call it the galactic, famous basketball she wrote. I don't know is it a newsletter? I'm going to call it a newsletter, okay?
It's a blog about the basketball played by the Indiana Pacers. That is the official subtitle.
Basketball She Wrote, a blog about basketball being played by the Indiana Pacers. Please go subscribe to that. The links are in the podcast and YouTube descriptions. You can follow Caitlin on the Twitter machine as well at C2_Cooper, spelled exactly as it sounds. We are going to talk about, if you didn't guess already, the 2023-24 Indiana Pacers, one of the most fascinating teams in the NBA, I think. And as people have already started to catch on, they'll be a league pass favorite, I think, for a lot of basketball fans. The first and most important question, though, before we begin, Caitlin, how the heck are you doing?
I'm doing well. I'm always excited to get the return invite back to this particular podcast. I've told you this before, but I think you asked tremendous questions that are very insightful about all 30 teams, and that's not easy to do. So thank you for inviting me to come back.
Thank you for coming back. I'm waiting for the year, and I've said this to Grant, where you're just going to be like, I'm too famous for this podcast. I can't do it. And I also said to Grant yesterday while we were recording, doing the outline for the Pacers is among the hardest because, one, I want to ask questions that are on your level, but you've influenced mine and I'm sure Grant's opinions so much on the Pacers that it's hard to just not regurgitate like what we've just consumed from Caitlin. Grant, how are you doing?
Nobody cares, Dan. But thanks for not thanking me for coming back because we did one yesterday and I'm back.
You're contractually obligated on that piece of paper you have not signed to return.
Okay, well, I guess that's true, but I'm here, so contractually obligated or otherwise. Yeah, I would echo what Dan said too, Caitlin. If I say something that you wrote and pretend as if it's my opinion, just move past it. So we'll just try to move past it.
We are all happy to see, though, Grant, that your setup is back to normal. As a peek behind the curtain, editing some of the shorts clips got a little difficult because of your angle, and I was the idiot that kept these little descriptors on that we needed. So if anyone cares about that, but Grant is fully restored to his typical frame, so we're excited. Let's start here, Caitlin. Looking at last season first, what was the driving force behind the pre-Haliburton injury success where I think they were 23-19 when he went out for that extended period of time?
Right. So I don't know that I would necessarily term it as the driving force, but I think it's important to say that a big contributing factor is that they were catching some injury luck early on at the season when they kind of stormed into being the surprise team. And the 5-game stretch that I always kind of like to look at and explaining that segment of the season, they won 5 games in a row. So the first win, they played the Raptors, no Siakam, no Fred VanVleet. And during the first half, they're undersized. They're giving up. The Raptors are going to the free throw line over and over again, making a parade there. So after halftime, they start doubling all the bully drives. The Raptors go like 3 of 21 from 3 in the second half, which is a fair gamble given what their roster limitations are as far as shooting, and the Pacers win that game. So then they play the Hornets. It gets to be the fourth quarter, very close game. LaMelo Ball and Bennedict Mathurin are kind of exchanging scoring barbs going back and forth. The Pacers decide we're going to half court trap LaMelo. The Hornets shoot like 1 of 9 in the fourth quarter from 3. Then they play Houston. Eric Gordon is ethering them. They have to make the adjustment to go switch to blitz. No Kevin Porter Jr. Then they get 2 wins over the Orlando Magic, and Paolo Banchero and Wendell Carter Jr. don't play in either game. And they also went switch to blitz against Franz Wagner. So the story I'm kind of trying to paint here is the Pacers deserve to get all of those wins. They made smart adjustments, but they were having to go to very extreme defensive tactics in order to give themselves a chance to outscore what was 5 opponents who didn't end up being in the playoff picture. So that was kind of leading to some of the early season success. And I was a little bit of a Debbie Downer because I was like, I think that they're overachieving at this point in time. And then when they got into being in December and they made the lineup change where they switched from Jalen Smith at the starting power forward and went to Aaron Nesmith and were playing even smaller, they went 8-2 right before Tyrese got hurt, and I believed in that a little bit more because they were finally finding like other ways to win. Tyrese was really finding his way in clutch time and in closing time. He hit the game winner against the Miami Heat, dealing with the Heat switches. They also beat Portland, where they held Portland to like 2 points over the last 6 minutes. They played Charlotte again, and when in the prior game, Charlotte had stayed in drop. This game, they showed the Pacers a lot of different types of coverages, and the Pacers adjusted. And I was like, hey, this is actually meaningful because they're showing that they can win in more than one way. They played the Raptors again. They absolutely crushed their bench. And then Tyrese obviously got hurt. So I think my short answer here and kind of like summarizing their season is I don't think they were quite as good as what they looked like during the very early portion of the season. I think that Tyrese Haliburton made meaningful strides. And then by the end of the year, when they shift to development mode, I also don't think they were as bad as what they showed at the end of the year. So I think they're somewhere right in the middle, just based on comparing themselves to last year.
I'm going to blow up the outline already because something you said really piqued my interest about the various different, kitchen sink type of tactics that the Pacers used during the stretch you were talking about earlier in the year, where let's try X, Y, and Z to get some defensive success here. And certain things worked and maybe those aren't sustainable. How do you see them being equipped going into the season? Assume everybody's healthy. I know it's hard to know certainly like what some of the front court rotation is going to look like. Do you see them having more of like a base setup with the personnel they have to defend consistently? This is not going to be a top 10, maybe not even top, half of the league defense, but what would you look at and point to as, ways that defensively this could be sort of a more solid, sustainable, consistent kind of outfit?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think the top thing that you can kind of look at to see where there might be changes to look at how they were using Myles Turner. So like just to give a matchup example, if they're playing a team like Cleveland with last year's starting lineup, Andrew Nembhard and Aaron Nesmith would get assigned to the top two options. So one of them would be assigned to Darius Garland. The other would go on Donovan Mitchell. Then Tyrese Haliburton would typically most games be assigned to someone like Isaac Okoro, where he's not having to defend on ball. He can conserve energy. And also he still has a ways to go with his screen navigation and getting overpowered in those types of situations. So then you're also starting Buddy Hield. So that means that Buddy Hield is going to be defending Jarrett Allen and Myles Turner's defending Evan Mobley. So Buddy would then be switching on all the ball screens. They would switch all the other screens, keep Myles Turner low to try to, prevent there being lobs. And because you have to have this backstop, you have to have him as passive size around the basket all the time because you're giving up so much size everywhere else. Now, like if you're playing a lineup with Jarace Walker, for example, you have an extra secondary rim protector. So now maybe you can put Myles Turner back at the 5 spot where he's just swallowing up pick and rolls again. You can play Jarace Walker as the low man, use his off-ball instincts. And I think that you'll probably see from the Pacers, not in every matchup, because I'm sure they'll adjust based on who their personnel is, because that's what this coaching staff tends to do. But just an overall, maybe a relaxation in what they were able to do, especially just having more size at the 4 spot where you're not having to constantly double the post and double other spots on the floor where they're putting themselves into rotation and making it harder to box out and to rebound as well. So I think that's the main shift that you'll see.
Does Bruce Brown, well, I mean, he will, but like what type of impact does Bruce Brown have on that defensive approach? Because he spends, and then is there a trickle down? Like, are they going to use him at the point of attack as much as Denver did? And if they do, what kind of a trickle down does that have on some of the other players on this roster who are going to be playing alongside him?
I would imagine to start games that you're going to have to play Bruce Brown at the point of attack. Because like, look at that Cleveland matchup again. I would anticipate that Andrew Nembhard and Aaron Nesmith are not going to be starting. So you're looking at Tyrese, Bennedict Mathurin, Bruce Brown, either Obi or Jarace Walker and Myles Turner. So in that arrangement, you're probably putting Tyrese Haliburton on Max Strus, which is going to be different than guarding Isaac Okoro. You're obviously going to have to track Max as a more threatening shooter. But Bruce is going to have to defend either Darius or Donovan Mitchell, which means you don't have both Nembhard and Nesmith out there. Ben's going to have to take one of those top options, which they were doing a little bit more of that over the final 10 games of the year last year and having him test that. We're like, okay, Ben, we're putting you on Fred VanVleet from the start of this game, and we're going to challenge you to do that. Or, okay, Ben, we're putting you on Jaden Ivey in the final home game of the season and to see what you can do. And I think that was a pretty mixed bag. There's times where he can be a stopper, like, oh, Shai Gilgeous just hunted me in space and I really held up and I got to stop in a key moment of a game. And there's other times where we're up in Toronto and you put me on Fred VanVleet and my screen navigation isn't good and I can't late switch and veer into the roller. So now we've had to make the adjustment where Aaron Nesmith's guarding Pirtle so we can start switching these ball screens and I'm being assigned to somebody else by the second half. So I think that Bruce Brown's trickle-down effect is he's going to be valuable because you need to have a point of attack defender out there if Tyrese and Ben are both in the starting lineup, but it's going to put more pressure on Bennedict Mathurin to take on top assignments as well because you don't have two people being Nembhard and Nesmith anymore out there.
As I look at this, what the roster for this coming season, there's a couple of unknowns, and Obi Toppin being one, but Mathurin to me, and I'm so curious about your opinion on this, seems like such a swing player because he's said, and I've heard you say that the expectation is that he's going to start. And just looking back at last season, Nembhard and Haliburton were, if you're just looking at like who played the most minutes together in the backcourt, those guys shared the court a lot. It sounds like if Mathurin is out there, you're certainly going to hope that he can defend, and I guess we'll see, and hope that he can do a lot of the other things that don't involve you just getting fouled and being a shot creator for himself essentially. I'm so fascinated by the Mathurin, Haliburton, and then Brown, I guess, and Hield comes off the bench. Maybe that just the push and pull that's going to create on offense and defense is fascinating to me. How do you see Mathurin taking up some of these new tasks that he's just going to have to? The defensive responsibility will be bigger, right? I assume, and he's going to be asked to do just more than score, I would imagine, if he's going to be a starter and not what I thought last year was a really effective, prototypical 6-man spark plug type of scorer.
Yeah, when you consider swapping Buddy out for Ben, it's like if the question was in the short term that the Pacers just want to win games, I think the clear answer would be you would be starting Buddy Hield. Because if you look at the numbers, like they did narrowly outscore opponents with Buddy and Tyrese both on the floor. When either just one of them was on the floor without the other, they got wrecked. Like both cases, if Tyrese was out there without Buddy, I think they got outscored by like 7.99. If Buddy was out there without Tyrese, I think they got outscored by like 6.3. So the reasons for that, like Tyrese is the engine of what they do in transition, but Buddy is very much an extension of it. He led the league and made transition threes last year per game. He led the league in attempts between 22 and 18 seconds on the shot clock. His willingness to run off of makes and misses and be able to stop and pop is obviously very valuable. And then also in the half court, the tension that he provides as a ghost screener, like one of the main tactics if Tyrese gets a switch is they will use Buddy to go ghost that switch. He provides tension as a stack screener. He just knows where to move in tandem with Haliburton. They have a real wavelength. That was the number one assist combo in the NBA on made threes. So I think that you would still lean Buddy there if you were just solely trying to win games. But in the long term, the Pacers need to know by the end of next year. I like that you said how critical of a year this is going to be because they need to know, is he a critical piece of this core? Is he a foundational piece or does he top out as more of a 6-man? And like, it's going to be interesting to watch because his usage swung pretty wildly. Like it was like 19% when he played with Tyrese versus like 26% when he didn't. So the arrangement made sense last year, I felt, to bring him off the bench and also just the accountability of it. Like they made him earn those minutes and earn that by the end of the season and like really held him accountable defensively that if he made mistakes on that end of the floor, like it just playing time wasn't unconditional. There was an earned element to it. And I think that there was value to that. But they need to know by the end of next year, how he fits with Tyrese. And I think that means starting him. So it will be interesting to watch. Like if because of what some of the limitations are in his game, if they're also starting Bruce Brown and they're also starting Obi Toppin, that's going to be a difference than when your middle three starters were Buddy, Nembhard, and Nesmith as far as like half court spacing. And they already weren't a great half court offensive team last year. I think they were like 22nd according to Cleaning the Glass. So if Ben sees more defenders loading up on his drives because of that, and he already struggles with passing out of drives, how much patience are they going to have rather than being like, okay, this isn't working, we're going to go to Buddy Hield? Like, I think you're going to have to exercise patience. Yeah.
What Mathurin, so with Mathurin, you say, and I think this is right, that the Pacers need to know what they have, sort of, I'm paraphrasing, but what singular skill do you think the Pacers would be most encouraged were they to see him show it in season 2? Because they're, he's just watching him play. He's a quirky catch and shoot player. Like, he doesn't seem to like it, but he has such other innate skills with, drawing contact and there's so much there. What do you think the Pacers are, maybe behind closed doors, or is it obvious? Like they really need him to show this to feel good about going forward?
I actually think it's like three main things. If I had to pick one, I like that you said that he's a quirky catch and shoot player because he's very wired to catch and drive and spot up situations. And I think he still needs to grow in his read of closeouts because he started last year shooting the ball at a pretty good level. And then after about midway through, that really tapered off. I think he finished it around like between 31 and 33% on jump shots. So he started seeing shorter closeouts. And when he sees the shorter closeouts, he has a tendency, he wants to play out a triple threat. So his go-to is to jab right and to put the ball on the floor with his left. He drives left on like 60% of his drives, and he'll do that even when he doesn't see a closeout. And this is why I think that he's going to see change in how he gets guarded next year, because if he's not hitting the three at a decent level and then he's automatically driving to his left, I wrote a piece on Patreon where I tracked all of his passes, skip passes, and passes to the right side of the floor from the left side of the floor, and he never made one with his left hand. So at Summer League, you could see times where they were really loading up on the drives because he loves to rip the ball baseline and go to his left. If you bring the second help defender to him, he ranked like in the bottom 5% of pass percentage among players who averaged at least 5 drives per game. So there's already reason to do that. And then if the spacing's less, there's going to be even more added reason to do that. So I think just shooting the inflow shots that come to him without double clutching or kind of playing with his food would be really big for him, because that'll allow him to beat the first level of the defense while you're still waiting for his passing to develop, because I think that's going to take time. Because I think some of it's skill-based and some of it's processing-based in terms of, him recognizing where kick-out avenues are. So I think the shooting is number one. But if you were to ask the Pacers, and I think Chad Buchanan even touched on this on the broadcast at Summer League, they need to see his shot go back where it was at the beginning of last season. They want him to pass the ball when he gets to the rim and recognize when he needs to pass the ball. And then defensively, they need him to make strides in most areas. There's just not a lot of things you can list right now where he's like really strong defensively, but he's so special at drawing contact. I do want people, like, if you didn't watch the Pacers a lot last year, over the last 5 seasons, there's only been 5 rookies who have averaged over 5 free throw attempts per game. And these are high-level players. It's Zion, Palin-Bercaro, Mathurin, Luka, and Trae Young. So that's the list. So He's very good. He's very flexible in the air. He definitely bends into contact. It's a gift, and it's not one that the Pacers have had in abundant supply for a very long time. So
you sort of alluded to this earlier, but if the continued investment in Mathurin's development is going to be so stark, you've now added Bruce Brown. You have Tyrese Haliburton. Buddy Hield and Andrew Nembhard, it seems like one of them is going to, kind of suffer from this. And I think it's easy to say, well, Buddy Hield's about to be a free agent. He might not be happy coming off the bench anyway. Will it be him that's marginalized? But also because of his shooting and the way this team is built, you wonder if he might be a little bit more important than Nembhard. Do you see either one of them seeing their roles be put in jeopardy or be diminished significantly because of how invested the Pacers are? Again, not just in Mathurin, but they did just pay Bruce Brown a lot of money.
The one that concerns me the most is the potential for Andrew Nembhard's role to get crunched, because I think with Buddy, it's most logical for him to be the first player off the bench and come into the game because of what his wavelength with Haliburton is. I suspect that he will come in early and that Ben might be the first player out just so that he can have more room to stretch his legs. And because defensively, there's going to be more insulation for both of them, potentially in bench lineups. If you're talking about, Nembhard, TJ McConnell, Jarace, and then whoever the 5 person ends up being. But with Andrew, it's interesting because obviously 2 game sample sizes of Summer League are immensely, meaningful and tell you everything about how a player is going to play the next year. But Andrew was very impressive in those 2 games. And the way you can tell how impressive he was is by what the offense looked like when he was no longer playing. It was very rough, them getting into their sets. And I just thought he was very comfortable moseying to his spots. He plays slow in the best possible way when he's manipulating the pick and roll. And defensively, he was quite good. And you could tell this by how often you could hear their bench saying, good Drew, when he was veer switching and really navigating out at the point of attack. I think he adds a lot, but then what you just said, if the starting lineup, Andrew's reward for that play at Summer League might be going from being a 2nd round pick who became a key starter largely because of his defense to now I've shown really good reads offensively to the point where I felt after 1 quarter at Summer League, he had shown enough. He played the entire first quarter and he didn't need to play anymore. He did, but he didn't need to play anymore. to potentially, you know, depending upon what they do with TJ McConnell, you go from being a starter to maybe an off-ball guard in the second unit, and Buddy Hield's the sixth man. So I think he's probably the most likely candidate to get crunched. And if I were in charge, I would be finding a way for him to play out of ball screens and run the second unit. That's what I would be doing, but we'll see how the Pacers see that.
We've talked a lot about the guards, and I think because some of the give and take of the various options there are so interesting, I don't know that we would be having to make so many, well, what if this guy or that guy decisions if Obi Toppin weren't on the roster. And that's the other big offseason acquisition. And he's part of the reason I think the Pacers may not be as small as they were, as often as they were last year. He's a really interesting player, Toppin. I think probably the consensus is he was not set up to succeed with the Knicks, just with the way their roster was and the things he was asked to do. I think, what do you think about his fit specifically next to Myles Turner? And what he, you know, if this works, what are X, Y, and Z that will happen? And if it doesn't work, where do the hiccups come from, you think, with that pairing?
Yeah, I mean, I think the biggest shift for Obi will obviously be that he's going into playing in a scheme that ranked, you know, second in time to shoot after a made shot. He loves to leak out. He's going to be going to a team that plays and wants to play in transition frequency. He and Tyrese have an existing relationship off the court. I think that Tyrese is very excited to play with him. And also just from the Knicks standpoint, he's never played with a big who can step out to the perimeter. He's played with Mitchell Robinson. He's played with Nerlens. He's played with Taj Gibson. I looked up, and for his entire career, he's attempted 27 shots as the roll man, moving to the basket. So
you said that on whatever, I can't remember which, I think it might have been the Dunked On podcast you did. And I was like, it was believable, but I was just like appalled.
Yeah, because I mean, there were times where he did roll, but it would be like you'd be watching he and Mitchell Robinson both rolling off a double drag.
Yeah, same time.
And like, yeah, and like that might cause some confusion, but like he wasn't often the person touching the ball in those situations. So I do think there's definitely a Tyrese Haliburton effect. You can see the swing in Myles Turner's 2-point percentage when he plays with Tyrese versus when he doesn't. I think that that'll be really good for Obi. Like I said, the spacing with Myles, the transition frequency, like I think the environment is all set up. Like last year, Obi set fewer screens than ever. He attempted more threes than ever and had fewer paint touches than ever. That's not going to be the case with the Pacers. What I wonder is if Obi has like a quote unquote breakout year, whatever that means for him in this context. I'm not saying he's going to be like an all-star or something for the Pacers. I do think he could have a very nice season for them, and that we'll be talking about him in a different context than we are right now. Is what will that mean for Myles Turner, and what will it mean for Jarace Walker? Because in Myles's case, like, yes, he can space out to three, but I think what he showed last year is that he's better as a five being defended by fives. Over the last 2 years, when he's defended by centers, he shoots 40% from three. When he's defended by forwards, he shoots like 32% from three. This has had a marginalizing effect on him throughout his career, going back to when, even before Sabonis, when it was Thad. They'd play games against Philadelphia, and Ben Simmons would guard Myles, and Joel Embiid would guard Thad because Thad was around the basket. And then that would mean, oh, we don't want Ben Simmons to switch onto the ball, so Myles is standing in the corner. And he's kind of made it clear that he isn't super happy with that type of a role in the past. Hence, you know, the article about I'm just a glorified role player here. So, you know, if Obi Toppin isn't just attempting 27 shots as the roll man and he's the person rolling to the basket, that means Myles is going to be doing more of the stuff that he was doing in the past. So what sort of effect that will have, like if you're going after somebody at the 4 spot and it's like Pascal Siakam, I think you accept, okay, Myles Turner might take a step back here, but we're getting an all NBA caliber player. If it's, you know, because Obi or Jarace's shot isn't falling as well and there's cross matching, like what happened with Jalen Smith last year, to the point where they ended up needing to change the starting lineup because it was disrupting their offense, then I think it's a little bit different calculus. And also if Obi breaks out, like you just drafted Jarace Walker at spot number 8. So, you know, how does he ascend and move up the food chain, so to speak? But I think the environment's set up for Obi Toppin to have a good season.
What I've been told by people who are much smarter than I, that I'm too low on Jarace Walker. I don't understand the theory of him on offense. And I've heard you talk about how maybe he could play, and you've been very clear, you're not comparing him to Draymond Green, but he could play some of that like facilitator role. What do you envision for him? What does he, one, do well on offense? And two, what do you envision for him offensively on this Pacers team, whether it's lineups or specific functions that they're going to try and apply to him?
I will say this. I don't think that what he was doing in Summer League was a good reflection of what he does well on offense. He did not shoot the ball well. He had to have a loose body removed from his elbow. They announced that a week after. So I don't know how much that was affecting his jump shot. He shot like 8 of 40 on jump shots. And then when Andrew and Ben were no longer playing, they didn't really have anybody else to run the offense. So it was a lot of point Jarace in ways that I just do not think you're going to see during the regular season next year when you have Tyrese and Andrew and TJ McConnell. And then, like, you could also hear during the Dallas game when Jared Dudley was coaching, he was yelling, like, shrink anytime Jarace had it on the perimeter, and they were sinking in off of everybody except for Ben Sheppard. So that was just making his overall shot profile a lot more difficult. So his efficiency looked pretty poor from those 4 games. I do think that he has more to show there. I don't know that I necessarily think he's going to be like a high volume, floor spacer. And that was kind of what I wrote in my piece about him during the pre-draft process is I watched how teams guarded him, because that's the true measure of spacing is how you get guarded when you're not shooting. And that was showing up a lot against Virginia's pack line. But I think how you envision him is like what you mentioned there when I made the comparisons to Draymond. Like he did get to do on occasion at Summer League the sets where like you're setting a stagger. Maybe Ben Sheppard's the person who's going to fly off the stagger. He curls the first pick with Jarace setting it, and then Jarace would turn around and fly off the second, get the ball, fake a handoff back to that guy, and then turn the ball downhill. He has a very sneaky keeper. He's good at the fake handoffs that Draymond likes to use against switches, which I think could pair really well with Tyrese Haliburton as a pull-up threat. And then he also has some short roll chops in his bag and making reads there. Of course, it helps when you're playing with somebody like Tyrese who can shoot off the dribble. That's not going to be super available to him with TJ McConnell as the point guard when people are ducking under. But that's something that he can do. I think that he processes the game at a high level. And what I said before on our other podcasts about liking guys who can keep playing when plays break down, that's something that Jarace can do. I think you can use him as a DHO operator. And then I just like to see him more as a screener. Like we basically didn't get to see that at Summer League. I think he finished 1 shot as the roll man because Andrew wasn't playing anymore. And he was having to be the pick and roll ball handler. Like there were times he was dribbling off a double drag and assisting Isaiah Jackson at the rim. So like, it was just a lot different role that I don't really think is what's going to be seen from him a lot during the regular season.
On the other end for Walker, we started out talking about kind of the different levers the Pacers may need to pull to kind of figure out what the defensive matchups need to be with sort of suboptimal and smallish, guard and wing personnel. Is it unfair to sort of hope that Jarace is just someone that can kind of come in and put out the fire? Like, cause his defensive versatility is a huge, part of his makeup. And is it unfair to think like, well, if we've got a shooting guard that's getting loose and we just can't do anything, can you throw him at someone like that? Or is that not quite, realistic?
The Pacers, when they talked about his pre-draft workout, talked about how impressed they were when he was guarding their assistant coach Pargo in space and in isolations. I think that I land on the side that he's better at switching out to like 2 3s and 4s. Mm-hmm. So when they played Oklahoma City, he played some minutes at the 5. He was defending Chet Holmgren and they were having him switch out. And I didn't think that went very well on either side of the pick and roll. Chet had a massive size advantage over their guards and was basically just dropping the ball in over the top. And on the perimeter, Jarace was giving up some step back 3s. He wasn't playing as close to the ball, I think, as you would like. But I think in general, it's always tough to expect a lot from rookies on the defensive end right away. But I just think his instincts are just really good as a help defender, and his hands are so quick. Like he gets away with gambles that other people just like, it would be so damaging to your defense, but for him, it works. Like he can go block shots from the wing and it's fine in an emergency rotation, or he can shoot passing lanes and it works out for him. So the Pacers bar is so low at the 4 spot from last year that I find it hard to think that he isn't going to provide some level of improvement right away.
I'm fascinated by this team's frontline rotation because you've talked about it, and it seems like the assumption is Obi Toppin will start next to Turner. They're clearly invested in Jarace Walker. But when you mentioned the concern about, well, we saw a bunch of different stuff from Myles Turner last year. Like he was able to set more screens. We saw him get more, interior touches. We saw him have more slips and cuts to the basket. When you're describing like what his offensive role was, if you're worried about limiting it, it doesn't feel like it's a great fit for Jarace Walker. We don't know if it's a good fit for Obi Toppin. Does that increase the importance of Jalen Smith? If you're still invested in Turner, do we read into, well, maybe they won't use Obi Toppin as the screener so often, because he did get up, I think it was like 8.5 3-point attempts per 36 minutes last year. How do you sort of just see that front line hodgepodge after Turner sort of shaking out?
I mean, Obi Toppin did say that in conversation with Rick Carlisle that he's been told he's going to play around the basket more, which,
Okay.
I mean, relative to what he was doing in New York, even
Right.
if the split is even, he is going to be playing around the basket more. And ideally, like, you would have two bigs on the floor who could roll or who could pop. So if Obi's shot can carry over to a degree, then maybe it is that fours will continue guarding Obi Toppin, and then they can both do a little bit of everything. And it's less predictable about who's going to roll or who's going to pop on a double drag. With regards to Jalen, I just kind of think about the backup 5 spot, and it's curious because a different guy kind of pairs well with a different person off the bench. So, like, in Jalen's case, he did not shoot the ball well. Like, I think of the people, there was like 169 players who attempted 150 catch and shoot threes last year, and Jalen's conversion rate was the worst out of all of them. But at least he does shoot. Like, the positioning of it does matter. You don't have to tether him to the dunker spot. So I think that might let Jarace do more things that we weren't getting to see at Summer League when he's playing with Isaiah Jackson and he's playing with Oscar Tshiebwe, and those guys are occupying that space in the middle of the floor. So there might be some more versatility to see what Jarace can do offensively. But Andrew Nembhard pairs really well with Isaiah Jackson as a role man. Andrew assisted him more at the rim than anybody on the roster. The numbers pair this out. When you look at them as a pick and roll combination, they produce more points per direct pick between Andrew and Isaiah than Andrew and Jalen. So it kind of depends on what your priorities are there. If you want to base the second unit's offense around the Andrew Nembhard, Isaiah Jackson pick and roll combination, then I guess Jarace is going to have to figure it out, and you're going to be seeing what he is as more of a stretch 4. If you're more concerned with developing Jarace, then I think you would lean toward Jalen or maybe, even Daniel Theis. I do think Theis is better right now as a player than Isaiah and Jalen, but can he play in a fast-paced scheme? I don't really know, because he only played like 7 games last year. I didn't see enough to know if he can hold up trying to do that. So, yeah.
FIBA World Cup champion.
Yeah, gold medalist Daniel Theis.
Yeah,
don't forget it.
Daniel Theis.
You need that version of Daniel Theis next year. We've gone a long time without really talking about Tyrese Haliburton. I don't know that we even really.
This is big for you, by the way, Grant.
I know it's been a struggle.
Are you okay? Are you okay?
I mean, just because I think we're all in agreement, and anyone that has watched much of him agrees, just offensively, he's special. But for me, having watched probably more Warriors games than any other team over the last 15, well, my whole life, if we're being honest, the one thing that's really interesting to me is the way that his rise is sort of paralleling Steph Curry's in one specific respect, which is he gets kind of picked on by opposing offenses, and a huge, you're never going to take him off the floor, obviously, because that's just a non-starter. So the Warriors, years ago, it's quaint to think about it now, but like, pre-switching, we can pre-switch. Like, that's a thing. And, the things they've done to hide Curry evolved from there. What can the Pacers do? Do they need to quote unquote hide Tyrese? Do they, this isn't new to them. I mean, you saw it last year where he was, attacked quite a bit. How do you expect that to shake out this year when, maybe they still don't have great options to just like stick him on someone non-threatening and hope nobody notices?
It was curious early on in the season, because I mentioned that game against the Raptors when Fred and Siakam weren't available, and everything from the Raptors was like bully drive after bully drive, just getting a mismatch in the post, which is kind of how their offense is a lot of the time when you think about it. But it was surprising how little they were going at Tyrese in that particular game. And I was like, I'm surprised at how infrequently teams are doing this. Then when he came back from injury, it was like a feeding frenzy. Like, they played Dallas in particular, and Luka was going after Tyrese frequently. And it isn't so much about his defense, which is certainly a part of it, but like wearing him down as the transition engine, there's an added incentive to be doing this. So like Utah, like Colin Sexton was calling him up into picks. Lauri Markkanen was hunting him in the post. It was like every possession, it felt like, in the crunch time of that game. And you talk about pre-switching. Like, this is where we're at. Buddy Hield gets pre-switched into picks so that Tyrese doesn't have to guard them. And again, like, that's in part to preserve how important Tyrese is. But when you feel more comfortable with Buddy doing that, than you do with Tyrese. Like that kind of says a lot. That's a bit of a 911 call. So the Pacers were already doing like a lot of things last year. I feel they would pre-switch him out of actions. You would see them do scram switches to get him off of post mismatches. They did switch to blitz type stuff. That was typically more with bigs, but there were occasions where like, okay, we're just going to get the ball out of that guy's hands. Maybe we can dictate who's going to beat us from there. And then like the main thing I mentioned, Luka, is that if there was a favorable switch with Tyrese, it was almost like the Pacers went into a 2-3 zone because the other person at the top would immediately be at the nail providing passive help. And if their guy cut, they didn't follow the cutter. So that was another aspect of it. I think it's just going to be like switch and shrink, honestly. Like, and just having guys who are better getting in and out from those types of situations, having more lateral size and length to be rotating out of those situations. And then also like an area that he could improve at, I think, is hedge and recover. Like, just don't give up that switch. Like, just be more active to prevent it from even happening in the first place. But I mean, it's definitely a thing. Like, there's a reason why it's gotten brought up, and it's something he's acknowledged. Like, he's like, to be honest, like, I think I just need to get stronger. Guys overpower me a lot. And if I'm going to hold people on this team accountable, like, it starts with me. So Tyrese is always very self-reflective, and he's probably about as hard on himself as anybody is. So we'll see when the season starts if he's made more strides there. I didn't see a lot of significant ones on ball. At the World Cup, obviously, we all saw the play where Opes got the corner three when he was trying to trail through the off-ball picks. So some of the screen navigation is still going to have to get better. But I do anticipate that, you know, for a team that was icing a lot of pick and rolls, that was, you know, doing a lot more peel switching, nexting, kind of more complex defensive tactics, that there's going to be more funneling to Myles Turner. So we'll see how if that helps out Tyrese at all, more veer switching, those types of tactics. I think there will be a switch in what they do.
Have you noticed, as someone that's watched, you know, every possession, does he also, just talking about Haliburton, get the, you know, the second he gets off the ball, the Curry treatment, which is we're going to grab, we're going to hold because we're trying to wear you down because you're so valuable to the offense. Does he get some of that same treatment, or I guess it's different because nobody's off the ball running around as much as Curry is. But.
Right. And that's actually an area where I wrote when I did a thing about Team USA and like things that I had noticed about him during the friendlies, is I still think that's an area where he could actually improve, is that in certain circumstances, because he has shown growth against switches offensively. But like one thing that I like that didn't happen a lot last year, and the reason I bring this up is because like if you play the Heat, it's much better for the Pacers not to be having, you know, and most teams not to be trying to attack a switch head on against Bam Adebayo.
Right.
So like if Tyrese gets that switch and then gives it the ball to like Andrew Nembhard, and then Nembhard intentionally drives at Bam, the natural inclination for most bigs is to help off and on the drive, and then Andrew gives the ball back to Tyrese, and Tyrese can attack that switch through a closeout then and get into the defense and make a play there. So for Tyrese's sake, I feel like he could still be better at sliding into passing windows at times. And that's why I was watching those minutes with him and Jalen Brunson fairly closely when they were happening in the World Cup, because I feel sometimes like even just like on a basic like baseline drive, baseline drift, he'll kind of stand behind his defender. So to answer your question, I don't think there's quite as much grabbing because Tyrese is willing to play off ball. He doesn't completely deactivate like Trae Young, but he isn't as active moving as what Steph Curry is to be getting grabbed in that type of way.
I know you focused on this, but in the macro, it doesn't seem like there's been a big focus because their transition attack was such a bear on offense last year. On just how bad the half court offense was. They were consistently in the bottom 10, like even before the Tyrese injury. Now you look at this roster and it's okay. They add Bruce Brown's craftiness, but it still feels like they have a lot of, you know, their starting lineup's going to have 3 wild card shooters, essentially, if you have Obi, Mathurin, and Bruce Brown in there. Are there any, aside from shooting, or, you know, what about the shooting? Like, what are the swing factors into this team improving their half court offense from last season?
I think that some of it from a half court standpoint last year was that they were not running super intricate sets. Like with a young roster, they were running more simplistic things, and they wanted to teach those guys to play in flow game and play random. And I think that naturally comes with some clunk, and it comes with some clunk when like Ben isn't the highest field player. Like that's still something he's learning how to do. So if you're not running more complicated actions and then you're teaching young guys how to play, for lack of a better term, I think that led to some of the inefficiency on that end of the floor. And then also, like, they just didn't have a lot of secondary playmakers. Like, if the first action didn't work, it would end up with Tyrese having to pound the ball and pick and roll, which isn't the worst gamble. He's a very good pick and roll creator, as we all know. But, like, I think that Bruce Brown will help in that regard, and that an underrated aspect of his game is that he can be a connective passer. He can play out of pick and roll some, and Andrew Nembhard can as well. But like, just having more guys on the floor who are able to continue advantages and get you to the next action, I think will help them in the half court. Though I, as you said, I do have some concerns about the spacing and what happens if teams are shrinking in off of that on the central aspect of Tyrese and the initial primary pick and roll action.
This gets away from some of the like tactical stuff we've been talking about, but and we've already mentioned his name. So Pascal Siakam was someone that was kind of loosely connected as let's just call him a person of interest, I guess, at various points. Certainly we speculated about it last year, and then there was some talk around the draft. I want to say, I'm terrible at remembering that kind of thing. But do you think the Pacers are, because that would be sort of run a little counter to what you envision this team being, is sort of gradually built, and we're looking for organic growth and that type of thing. But to go swing a move for an all NBA type of player, who fits, in my opinion, like phenomenally well, just as a hypothetical, but from a team building perspective, it's kind of incongruous with what Indy's doing. Like, do you think a move like that is what the Pacers intend to do at some point, whether it's Siakam or not? Like, are they keeping the powder dry, as we like to say, to go, make a move like that? Or is that just a little too like quick fixy and risky, obviously with free agency being, right around the corner too?
I think the way that I summarize what they did this offseason is that they're trying to make a push for the playoffs while also maintaining flexibility to build around Haliburton long term. And the Bruce Brown contract is as malleable as he is as a player. So the fact that they have that team option means that he might be included in a trade as early as this year. That would be counter to how the Pacers typically operate when they sign someone to a contract. They like to keep them through the first year. They say, like, we don't sign guys to be trade assets necessarily. But, I do think between OG Anunoby and Pascal Siakam, I would think that OG would be your top priority there because he is younger and because I truly think he might be the most positionalist defender in the NBA. And I think he would solve a lot of things for them, that he would be the top priority. But Pascal also, like what I said before, like, I don't have as many concerns about Myles Turner taking a step back if you're adding an all NBA caliber power forward who, you could make those arguments with Sabonis too. Like, there wasn't a lot of reason to take possessions out of Sabonis's hands to give them to Myles Turner. But the difference being is Sabonis was not going to be able to help Myles Turner defensively the same way that Pascal Siakam will, and just overall on their defense. So to have somebody who can create their own shot and create for others at the 4 spot, I think would be big for the Pacers. But I think it's almost more telling that there was a quote around the draft where Chad Buchanan, and I'm paraphrasing here, effectively said that, like, they looked at potential opportunities to move the number 7 pick for guys who are on expiring contracts. We can connect the dots there. Right. And that, without knowing if those guys were going to want to sign an extension, like, that's too risky for them as a small market team, which I agree, it would be very risky. And I'm not saying that they need to do that before the first year of Tyrese Haliburton's contract has even come into play. But if you're not willing right now to bet on Tyrese Haliburton and bet on your ability to win games by getting Pascal Siakam, I think that's somewhat telling of where you think you are on your timeline. Like, clearly, if you thought you were closer to contention, I think you might be willing just to take that risk and bet on those guys. And I think that at a certain point in time, that is what they're going to have to do. Like, that's the way they're going to get the second guy to play with Tyrese, is they're going to have to take some type of risk like that. I just don't think that they necessarily think we're that close, that we're just like one Pascal Siakam away, where they'd be willing to take a risk on, like, only the second single-digit pick that they've had in like 30 years.
The Pacers I feel like, are really effective at delivering and selling their ethos to their fan base relative to other teams, because when Grant and I talked about the Siakam Pacers fit, like a couple months ago when it first came out, we were both smitten, by like the functional benefits.
New word you just made up.
Pacers fans were aggressively pushing back against everything we said about just why they wouldn't do that. And so I have to give like a tip of the cap to the organization for really doing a good job of clearly selling their ethos and the value of it to the fan base.
I think part of it too is that people like really beat against, like the whole Carmelo Anthony getting traded to the Knicks things of like, why would we give up assets if we could just sign that guy? Like, why would we give up assets for OG Anunoby if we could just sign him next summer? And I'm like, well, because you get a year of trying to persuade him to stay here. Like, and maybe he's not really interested in going to a small market team. Again, it's very risky, but like, I do think there's some value in that and getting the experience of playing with Tyrese and knowing, I think Tyrese gets guys paid. I truthfully do believe that. I think if you come play with Tyrese Haliburton, you're gonna play better than where you did at your last stop. But I think that's some of it. Is I think a lot of fans are like, why would we give something up if we could just pitch him in free agency next year?
Yeah.
I would just say, when's the last time the Pacers signed an OG Anunoby or Pascal?
That's the counter. Yeah. All things
David West.
I wanted to ask you about Ben Sheppard because I'm basically a child, and all it takes is one play, especially for a player I know minimally about since I don't cover the draft, for me to become enamored with them. And I wasn't a Ben Sheppard guy before the draft, even coming out of the draft. Then there was a play in Summer League where he's battling. I know Chet Holmgren's not the strongest dude, but he's freaking huge. And you have Ben Sheppard just battling with him and then comes and jumps the pass and takes it away from him. So I'm officially a Ben Sheppard believer. Do you have any initial impressions on Ben Sheppard? Is there even like a modicum of a chance that he does anything for a team that's like kind of set on guards right now?
I like Ben Sheppard. I mean, I think it's interesting. Chad Buchanan said the first thing that Rick asks whenever they are evaluating draft prospects is, can he shoot? And I do believe that Ben Sheppard can shoot, and in a variety of contexts, whether it's, backpedaling out to the corner, shooting off a screen, shooting in transition. I think that matters to the way that the Pacers want to play. That being said, I don't really see a clear path to him cracking the rotation unless you're moving both of TJ McConnell and Buddy Hield. Because I just don't really know where the spot's going to automatically come from. And then that does kind of create an interesting question from like a draft strategy standpoint that Ben kind of projects. I do think he needs to get stronger to help his finishing and to help. He had good moments defensively in Summer League, but it's like his contest wouldn't really do that much because he's getting pushed under the rim. Like he did what you're saying. Like he swam the post, like he battled, but like just his overall on ball defense, he would kind of get pushed under the rim some. So like there is a strength element to him, but like he kind of projects as this plug and play type player. But if there isn't an opportunity for him to play, then does it make more sense for you to have drafted somebody who maybe needs more development? And therefore, if they do need to stay with the Madians for the year, there could be more like potentially untapped upside from that pick. Like that's kind of interesting with the way that the Pacers have been making draft picks, especially with what just happened with Chris Duarte. There's a lot of reasons why Chris isn't playing for the Pacers anymore, but like he looked like, promising as a rookie, and now they just traded him for 2 seconds, similar to what the Knicks did with Obi Toppin. So I'm not saying that that's what's necessarily going to happen with Ben. I like Ben. I just don't see a clear path, at least as a rookie, for him getting into the rotation unless there's injuries or like a couple of trades.
It is cookie cutter question time, as Dan likes to say, but this is not a cookie cutter question. This is a great question that Dan has prepared here. And you've been, as is the case at this time of year, doing the circuit of, various interviews and podcasts and that kind of thing. And have had to talk about the Pacers at great length and have written about them at great length for a long time. Is there anything that we didn't ask you or that you have not been asked at all or have rarely been asked that you think is a really, whether it's like a pivot point for the season or something really interesting to you that just maybe the normal fan doesn't know about the Pacers, or what should we be watching for this year that we have not covered today and that maybe you haven't gotten to talk about as much as you'd like to?
And I think maybe today the only player that we didn't really touch on is maybe Aaron Nesmith. And he really did establish himself. I mean, he plays really freaking hard. Like that's the one thing that you can always count on from him. And I commend him for the fact that he was kind of the unsung hero that kind of turned their season when he did step into being a starting four. That's not what I would have projected from him last summer. If you had asked me what role will Aaron Nesmith have, that's not what I would have said. But now it's like you kind of look at the depth chart and it's again like the whole TJ McConnell thing. Like it feels like the spot in that second unit is either going to be TJ's or Aaron's, and going from being a starter to potentially, either not being on the rotation or being on the fringe is kind of an under-discussed thing because, they need, I think, critically to be at least a top 20 defense if they want to get into the playoffs or be competitive in the play-in tournament. And they can build lineups where it's like, oh, wow, like that's an intriguing lineup. What if they play Nembhard and Nesmith and Bruce Brown and Jarace Walker and Myles Turner all at the same time? But it's like, how are they getting to that lineup with how many rotation players they have? So, yeah, I mean, I think that maybe people didn't necessarily notice. Aaron's kind of a foul machine. He struggles to finish some of his defensive possessions without fouling, but I do think he had a nice season with the Pacers, and it feels like he isn't necessarily going to get worse. It's just that there's not necessarily going to be the same opportunity for him as there was a year ago.
I still get nervous every time he takes more than like 2 dribbles.
Especially if he's doing it with his left hand, generally. It's a little bit dicey.
So we've talked a lot about who's going to play, and it feels like there's probably 8 or 9 locks for the 10-man rotation. How do you sort of see and it could be shorter than a 10-man rotation. Maybe they branch out beyond 10 men during a normal night, but like, what would the 10-man rotation in your estimation be for this team?
Yeah, I mean, my best guess for the starters, Tyrese and Myles are locks. Ben kind of indicated that on a secondary broadcast with Stephen A. Smith that he expects to be the starting 3, which he was already starting the last 10 games of last year. So I don't think that would exactly be a shock. I think it'll be a camp battle between Obi Toppin and Jarace Walker. And then because of how they handled Ben last year, it wouldn't surprise me if they bring Jarace off the bench as a rookie and the nod goes to Obi Toppin. And then I don't think you're paying Bruce Brown $22.5 million to come off the bench. So I think he'll be the last starter there. And then the reserves, I think you can probably look at Buddy as 6th man, Andrew, and then a choice between TJ and Aaron Nesmith. And then Jarace Walker, backup 4, he needs to be playing. And then, rotation carousel at the 5. I would probably lean toward Jalen right now, but I don't know where the Pacers will land on that after training camp. We'll have to wait and see.
Yeah, that's it. We haven't really mentioned Isaiah Jackson at all. He's just a victim of the squeeze, it seems like, up front, or are there going to be matchups where maybe he does make more sense than, whoever it is, Smith or Walker or whoever?
Yeah, I mean, I think he pairs well with Andrew Nembhard. Like I said, I think they were one of the better lob combinations in the NBA last year, and they didn't even play that many minutes together. But my enduring question with Isaiah continues to be, is he a small ball 5 or is he a 5 who is small? Because he doesn't do that many small ball 5 things. He's just kind of like an undersized traditional 5. And I am in year 2, and I still don't know what his ideal pick and roll coverage is. Theoretically, he moves really well and can cover a ton of ground. So you think it's going to be switching, but he tends to want to stand up. He doesn't always take the best angles. His drop coverage still has a long way to go. Part of me thinks it's blitz because he can be more proactive and force negative dribbles and then give himself time to get back. And he does cover ground so well, but they don't necessarily have the roster to accommodate playing blitz because they don't have a lot of length, or at least they didn't last year. So defensively, their numbers are not good with him out there at solo 5. And rebounding wise, I do think he made a few strides there during summer league, especially on the offensive glass. But he's just still a question mark for me. And I'm not sure he should be as much of a question mark entering into his 3rd season. So that's kind of where I land.
Given that it seems like the starters are fairly well established, do you envision the closing lineup, obviously accounting for sometimes matchups just are, going to call for different things? Do you envision the closing lineup on most nights differing from the starting lineup? And if so, who's in and who's out?
I think it will. And I think that could be telling because last year, I think their most used closing lineup was the same as the starters, the starting lineup with Aaron at the 4. And then their other most used one was Tyrese, Buddy, Myles, with both rookies being Ben and Andrew. So I think it might depend, are you in crunch time and you're up by 6 or you're down by 6? But I would anticipate that both of them will include Tyrese, Buddy, and Myles, and then Bruce Brown. And I won't be surprised if Bruce Brown is out there at the 4 and they're playing smaller, just because I don't know what to project from Obi Toppin defensively quite yet. And expecting to throw Jarace out there as a rookie feels like a lot. So if you're up by 6 and you're trying to maintain a lead, I could see them playing a lineup of Tyrese, Ben, Buddy, Bruce, Myles. If you're down by 6 and you need to get stops, I could see it being, Tyrese, Andrew, maybe Aaron Nesmith, Bruce, Myles, if you really need to get stops. Otherwise, I bet that Buddy will be in the starting lineup or in the closing lineup, which means you're probably playing smaller to accomplish doing that.
Is there a weirdo, quirky, wonky lineup that you would like to see them try?
Yeah, give me all the defense. Give me the best defense at every position. Or if Tyrese is still going to be out there, then give me some combination of Tyrese and Myles, and then pick between Bruce and Jarace and Andrew and Aaron Nesmith, and just put as many defenders out there so that we can see a better product than what we've seen the last 2 years.
Grant, did you have one for this team?
I mean, I just put Tyrese out there with 4 defenders because I figure he can. If somebody's going to generate shots for guys that can't do it themselves, I would just trust him to do it, and then you cover up for him on the on defense. You always have the weirdest ones, Dan. What's yours? How small is your lineup?
Yeah, it's small. So I tried to find a lineup where Jarace Walker was at the 5, but you still sort of supercharged the defense. So I settled on, because TJ McConnell just can't play off the ball, so I couldn't really put him in this lineup. I have Bruce Brown, Aaron Nesmith, Jarace Walker, Tyrese Haliburton is just going to be out there because it's Tyrese Haliburton, and then Andrew Nembhard. I feel like that's pretty tame by my lineup standards.
Yeah.
And the thing is I don't think it's outside of the realm of possibility that Jarace will play minutes at the 5, because I think offensively, like, a lot of his skill set tracks to being a 5, and they played him at the 5 minutes in summer league. So like, I don't think it's that outlandish.
The real supercharged defensive line, they'd be like, just sub out Haliburton for McConnell. I don't know what that torpedoes your spacing and offense, but that would supercharge your defense.
That's like a 75 offensive rating team right there. You want to do the over under? This is a great over under line. It made me feel really smart because when I did my preseason predictions, I was close to this. Caitlin, it's 38.5. That is the Pacers. I guess the Vegas line, Dan. This is where I'm not sure where it came from exactly.
We're not sponsored by them, so I won't say.
Yeah, we're not going to shout out anything. How do you feel about that number? And well, if you want to make an exact record prediction, feel free. But I always hate doing that, so I'm not going to ask you to do that unless you want to.
Yeah, so I mean, I underestimated them last year badly. Like, I assumed that they would move Buddy and Myles before the trade deadline, so I kind of baked that into how much I underestimated them, but I was still wrong regardless.
You make trades, Caitlin. You're always just on that trade machine.
Yep, I know. And now I feel like I might be overestimating them a little bit. But in the games when Myles Turner and Tyrese were both available, they played at a 44 win rate, and they had a slightly negative net rating, which was almost identical to the Miami Heat's last year. So I think the Pacers are going to the NBA Finals next year. But I'm just kidding. But I would take the over. I think that last year when those guys were available, they had already shown that they were a little bit better than what their record ended up being by the time they had pivoted to development mode. And I do think that Bruce Brown's going to help them. I do think that Jarace Walker will help them to a degree based on how poor their defense was last year. So I'll take the over.
This feels, and I haven't settled on ours yet because we haven't done the conference pods, but this feels very last year Kingsy to me. And I've said this about the Orlando Magic line too, where I see 38.5. I'm kind of like, I don't know, that feels too low. And if it was like, and the Magic feels even lower to me, but I'm looking at it right now and I'm just like, that feels low. That's my initial just like impressions of the 38. And where did you land with it, Grant?
I this is just, preliminary, haven't done any deep dives. I think like 39 felt about right to me because I think I think they played, this is again the full season, and it's just based on their differential last year. They were like a 31-ish win team, based on their net rating. And I think they won 35. Is that right? I could be off by a couple, but so I'm kind of pricing that in. Like, I think they'll get a lot better, but I'm assuming they're starting from a lower baseline just based on the differential as opposed to the record last year. So that's how I'm sort of justifying going just slightly over. See,
I look at it as like, 35 wins. They just need 4 more.
They need 4
that's my logic.
And they were 1-10 or 1-9, and when Haliburton missed that stretch. So there you go.
Caitlin, do you think the wide openness of the East benefits or hurts them in that regard? Because I think if you really go through it, because of what's going on with Damian Lillard and James Harden right now, maybe you want to price in and say, okay, we know that Dame is going to go to Miami. So then there's like maybe 4 teams that I'm prepared to say, if Dame's in Miami, are better than like every other team with Boston, Miami, Cleveland, and Milwaukee. And then after that, I'm like, if you told me, I wouldn't predict it, but if you told me the Pacers were better than the Knicks and the Nets and the Hawks, like that wouldn't surprise me. But it could also go the other way where it's like, did the Hornets just like sort of did the Magic jump the Pacers? So do you think the wide openness benefits them in like sort of that regard, or could it potentially hurt them more?
I mean, I think it benefits them, and just like health in general is a very boring topic to talk about. But like when you just compare them to the Bulls, like the Bulls have a very sustainable defense, but their top guys all were very healthy last year. Like I think the fewest games any of their top three, including if you include Patrick in there too, like they all played 75 or more games, and they still were only like one game over 500. Versus the Pacers, Tyrese played like 56. Myles missed a number. Like I said, when they were both available, they were playing at a 44 win rate. So obviously the East changes, but like I don't think that I would put them in solidly a playoff spot right now. But I think that they could make it into the play-in tournament, and I think that they're also a hard team to play. When like Giannis touched on this when they played the Pacers, and we're like, when you have to go play at that pace for an entire game, like that's something that's hard to do to get up to do. Especially with the way that they run off of makes. So I think that can be hard to deal with in the regular season. We'll see how it translates in a play-in tournament situation, or if they were to get into the playoffs out of the play-in tournament. But I'm pegging them in the 7 to 10 range is where I see it playing out.
Anything we missed about this team that you think still needs to be discussed? Like strong Jordan Nwora takes? Anything along those lines?
I mean, Jordan Nwora wasn't bad for them last year. I did watch like one specific play that they ran with him was almost money all the time, because I don't understand why defenders defended it the way that they did. But apparently he's trying to drop weight so that he can play more positions. So we'll see.
Caitlin, are you just able to tell our listeners once more where they can find you and all the fantastic work that you're putting out?
Right. So my Twitter handle is at C2_Cooper. If you go there, there's a link to the Patreon. That's patreon.com/basketballshootout, where you can find all my work. A fair amount of it is unlocked. So if you just want to do like get to know me and see what type of work I get to do, I encourage you go over there, read it, check it out. And then if you want to become a patron, I of course would be happy to have you. Whoops, my computer's shaking.
And the links to those will also be in the pod and YouTube descriptions, and just pay for it. Enough with the free stuff. Just go pay for it. Grant, do you want to take us out?
I would love to. Thank you, Caitlin, so much. Really appreciate you coming on. Everybody, please, as Dan said, follow Caitlin, subscribe, join Patreon. Just consume everything she does, especially if you're interested in the Pacers at all and you're not all over what Caitlin is producing. I'd like to understand how that's possible. But as guys that cover the NBA from a national perspective, still invaluable work. Speaking of, you can follow us at GT_Hughes, at Dan Favale, at HardwoodKnocks. Rate, review, subscribe, tell your friends and enemies, do all that stuff so we can grow and have more great guests like Caitlin. And we will close, as always, with a shout out to the one and only Frank Ntilikina and an apology to Jared Allen.